by all saying the Pledge of Allegiance. I'll begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay. The next thing we do at our Rotary meetings to start is the Rotary has a four-way test, and it's a fairly simple test, but it kind of says what we should, a four-way test of the things we think, say, or do. Number one, is it fair? Is it true? Number two, is it fair to all concerned? Number three, will it build goodwill? Number four, will it be beneficial to all concerned? Certainly, if we all followed that, life would be a lot simpler. In any event, it's good to think about. All right, now we have presenters here from the climate change. I forgot the association's name.
Citizens Climate Lobby.
Yes, Citizens Climate Lobby. And I think, well, without further introduction, we have their bios on the website. So I think without further introduction, I think we could go straight into their presentations and get started. I see Dave's joined us. Hi, Dave. Dave Smith. Anyway, it's good to see all you here. We'll get started. Let me just check one other thing. Okay. All right.
All right.
Yes.
Should I take it? Do you guys mind if I share my screen?
No, that would be great. Why don't you start, tell us a little bit about yourself and then start with the screen share.
Okay. So my name's Glenton Jelbert. I've been with Citizens Climate Lobby for just over a year. I mean, I volunteer. I actually do other things for money. But Citizens Climate Lobby is largely a volunteer-driven organization. I discovered them about just over a year ago, and I heard a talk and discovered that they were fairly far ahead in thinking about the solutions that we've all kind of known could happen, but hadn't thought there was the political will to make them happen, and to discover that they were very far ahead in getting that, in unlocking some of these issues, which is what we're going to talk to you today about. It was very exciting to me, so I sort of jumped in with both feet. Jeff, do you want to introduce yourself briefly? We'll come back to this actually later just now.
So I'm not used to all this mute, unmute, and all this other stuff. My name is Jeff Stoddard. I'm the CEO and president of AIS. Born in Bakersfield, live in Anaheim, and I grew up in Alaska in the San Francisco Bay Area. I have a Bachelor of Science in Engineering and an MBA. I run a company here in Anaheim. That's a computer services company. So I'm relatively new to Citizens Climate Lobby. I was on the fence for a number of years, kind of waiting for the science to be validated, that there were a lot of claims being made. And over the past several years, I kind of reached the conclusion that really have a problem, but the solutions didn't seem very practical when I looked at those. And when I discovered Citizens Climate Lobby, CCL, I became interested because they have a very practical solution to the climate change problem. And that's kind of what Glenton and I wanted to talk to you about today.
All right, I'm going to share my screen briefly. So let me know if you can see that now, hopefully. And I'm going to be keeping an eye on the group chat. So if anyone wants to, put questions and whatever, we will try to either handle them as we go or handle them if we know it's coming up later, we'll try and handle it there. So do please feel free to ask questions. I wanted to particularly thank you all for taking the time to come and listen. It's we're really excited to present to you, and especially for Fred Anderson. Thank you for helping us. It's been very helpful, and he's been very organized in making this happen, and we really appreciate the efforts. So yeah, as we said, Jeff and I are here to discuss climate change and the journey we've been on to end up talking to you all here today. I know climate change might not necessarily be the first topic that comes to mind right now. We've got coronavirus and racial tensions taking center stage. But I wanted to point out that both of these topics are actually related to climate change. For example, climate change disproportionately affects people of color. A recent New York Times article highlighted that Black women suffer disproportionately and are more likely to give birth to premature stillborn babies because they often live in areas most heavily afflicted by pollution and most vulnerable to climate change. Coronavirus, on the other hand, has led to lowered economic activity, which has actually been better for climate emissions. A recent study showed that greenhouse gas emissions dropped by 17% since last year, which might sound impressive, but it's actually nowhere near enough. This might lead us to think that what we're looking to do is stifle the economy in our daily lives, and that maybe that's the only way to save the climate. But what we hope you'll learn through our talk today is that we can decarbonize our economy without disrupting it. We can decarbonize our economy without disrupting it. In fact, we can even make it better. We can preserve the environment while simultaneously having a thriving and more equal society and economy. So this afternoon, we're going to talk about 3 steps: acceptance of the massive problem of climate change, hope that there is a solution that's simple, progressive, and undisruptive to our daily lives, and action, the actions that we can all take to bring that solution into reality. Jeff will talk about the first 2, the acceptance and hope, for about 20 minutes, and I will talk for about 5 minutes about some of the tangible actions we can all do. And as I said, if you have questions as you're going, please feel free to drop them in the comments section. So we've kind of introduced ourselves already, but let me let Jeff fill in any gaps that you may have left.
Sure. So thanks, Glenton. And I wanted to thank everyone for making some time for us today. Like Glenton said, it may not be the first topic that comes to mind, although over the past week or so, I have to admit, I've been thinking a lot about climate because it seems so darn hot. But we really believe it's an important issue, and it's something that in my company, we've started to pay close attention to. We're actually making some moves with our technology to start looking at how we can help mitigate climate change. So it's something that we're taking very seriously. And I'm starting to get quite a bit of traction with other companies. IBM and PricewaterhouseCoopers have teamed up with us on one of the solutions that we're creating. So it's not trivial. I think a lot of companies in particular are starting to see that this is something we've got to focus on. Glenton? Yeah,
thank you. So yeah, this is a picture of my family, including the dog, down at the climate change protest last year, obviously pre-COVID. And yeah, as I sort of said earlier, I've felt frustrated that nothing seemed to be happening. If you talk to people about, I've asked a lot of people this question. I say to them, is climate change something we can safely ignore? It's sort of a safe way into a conversation. And most people will tell me no, they don't think we can ignore it. And then I say, well, what are you doing about it? And they say, well, I'm recycling. It's like, well, okay, that's maybe not what we need, right? I mean, great, carry on recycling, but it's not going to solve the problem. So CCL is born out of that kind of frustration, and it's been years to get it to where it is. So I want to hand back to Jeff to tell us a bit about CCL.
Yeah, so thanks, Glenton. So CCL, we're an international organization with the majority of our groups in the United States and Canada. But we also have groups in Australia, India, Germany, Sweden, Panama, and a number of other countries. It's a growing organization. We're a nonpartisan group. We're completely volunteer driven as well. So we're a nonpartisan group. We really don't take sides in this. We feel like climate change is something that affects everybody. It doesn't really matter what political party they're in. We're a solution-focused organization. We believe in carbon fee and dividends, and I'll get into that more later. And we really respect and appreciate and have gratitude for everyone. We're not out here trying to force people to believe in something, but we are somebody that we really try to embrace everybody, and we want everyone to know that this is a problem that we as humanity have and need to accept and try to solve, because we have some responsibility in what's going on. When it comes to our two organizations, I see three intersections when it comes to the climate. So looking at some of Rotary's focal areas, climate and its effects on maternal and child health is one area. The planet's heating up. It puts additional stress on the health of mothers and their children. We're seeing accelerated impacts upon populations in Africa and the Middle East. And when it comes to heat starvation, so as ecosystems are experience climate change, they're becoming unsustainable for wildlife and human life. Second focal area, climate and water availability and safety. Drought, wildfires, and changing weather patterns are threatening our global freshwater supply. Aquifers in some parts of the world are drying up, and weather patterns are shifting, making their regeneration highly unlikely in the short term. And finally, I know Rotary has a new area they're focused on called supporting the environment. And climate change sits square in the center of that new initiative of Rotary. And the mitigation of climate change will really be key to achieving this objective. One other thing to note, our founder, Marshall Saunders, he was a longtime member of Rotary and received many awards for his meritorious service. So when we look at climate change, we see it's a global problem. And by the way, that little hexagon or up there is actually me in an igloo that I made when I was a kid. We see it's a global problem. It affects all of us. But what's causing it? And so briefly, I just want to discuss and remind everyone what's happening, what's behind the science behind climate change. So fossil fuels, when they're burned, they're a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, which cause global warming. Greenhouse gases act like a heat trapping blanket. Without them, we'd be a giant ball of ice. So we can't do without them, but with too many, our planet heats up too much. And that's kind of where we're headed right now. I recently came upon an article written about the Arctic and how it's impacting Native Americans and their way of life. And you might be asking, well, why would a Southern California care about that? About 50 years ago, my family moved from Bakersfield to Alaska. My dad was with Standard Oil California, later rebranded as Chevron. He was part of the North Slope Prudhoe Bay development team. He was a geologist. We lived in Alaska for nearly 5 years, and then I grew to appreciate the culture, wildlife, and nature in general in Alaska. The natives of that state hold a really special place in my heart. The climate is changing rapidly in Alaska, more rapidly in Alaska and the Arctic Circle than in other parts of the globe. The rate of ice melt is so severe that by 2034, they're anticipating there'll be no summer ice left in the Arctic. So I thought about the Native Americans I knew and admired, and had watched them race their sled dogs every year at the Fur Rendezvous, which started in Anchorage. And I realized we could lose an entire culture and ecosystem as a result of climate change. And it really brought that problem closer to home because I lived in Alaska during my formative years. And I began thinking about solutions, kind of what Glenton was alluding to. But the more I thought about it, I realized everything around me requires energy. So my phone, my laptop, my house, it all took energy to build, to run, and it was most likely created with energy that's emitting greenhouse gases. The problem is so embedded in our society that it just felt overwhelming, impossible to solve. All the things that I felt that I could personally do, like buy a Prius, which I did, recycle, invest in solar, which I did, they all feel kind of meaningless when you look at the magnitude of the problem. I didn't really know what else to do at that point, but feel kind of a sense of hopelessness. And I realized looking back, that's kind of the moment I emotionally accepted climate change, because it meant accepting and subjecting myself to a problem that felt too large to solve. And that's really not a good feeling. But I think the problem actually really started to hit home recently in a very significant way. I began to realize that this issue was really one I was not going to be able to ignore. And that was because it's coming from an unquestionable trusted messenger, and that's Mother Nature. And I think most of you are going to relate to this story. I moved back to California in 1994 and into Orange County in 1997. And every year since 2008, it seems to be, we're constantly looking at a picture like this. Most of you probably remember the freeway complex fire that swept through Yorba Linda, Anaheim, and Brea, and the Holy Fire in 2018 that burned along the 241 in Anaheim, Orange, and Tustin. In each instance, my family had to evacuate our home, my kids had to evacuate their schools, and our lives were significantly disrupted. These fires, coupled with the mitigating factor of climate change, has caused longer and more severe droughts, making the area much more susceptible to wildfires. And honestly, we're seeing it again right now. It's gotten so bad that many insurance companies no longer offer comprehensive fire insurance to hundreds of thousands of households because it's too expensive. And fortunately, that also included my home in Anaheim Hills. AAA dropped my policy last year, and it took several weeks to find anybody that would even pick it up, but at 2.5 times the price. I knew at that point I really couldn't just sit around and do nothing. I needed to act. Unfortunately, many people in our area actually feel the same way. So Glenton took this photo in September of 2019 during a climate rally in Irvine. But these rallies weren't just happening here. They were actually happening all over the world in 150 different countries. Over 7.5 million people showed up that day. This is really a result of a major shift in people's views on climate. Over a decade ago, only 30% of Americans thought climate change was a top priority for Congress. And by the way, I didn't think it was either. Now it's over 50% Republicans are changing their mind too. And as a brief aside, I grew up as a Republican and I worked for President Bush in the early 90s. So I'm in that group. The majority of Republicans under the age of 38 now think the government should be doing more to address climate change. Unfortunately, I'm not in that group. The point, I'm clearly not 38 anymore. The point I'm making though is that people's perspectives are changing, but still, why does it feel like nothing's happening? To understand that, let's take a look at this photo. So let's say that each individual or organization is an instrument in this orchestra. They're assembled and they're ready to go, but there's something missing in this picture. So what's missing? They need a musical score, a plan, something that they can all play together. In the world of climate change, that means we need a national climate policy that everybody can rally behind. We need a policy, something that could take this world that we live in now on the left to move into this world on the right. And it needs to be a single unified plan, something everybody can get behind. You might be thinking a single plan that everyone can agree upon. That seems like an impossible task. Congress can barely agree on anything. I thought this for a long time too, but just bear with me for a second. Let's take our thoughts out of the world on the left and into the world, imagined world we see on the right. What would this ideal world look like? What are some of the qualities of such a policy if we could theoretically advance? I've had some time to think about this, and we each have our own opinions about what this policy might look like. However, I believe these are most of the important qualities that a good policy needs to have. So it needs to be good for people. It needs to be good for people today and tomorrow. We don't really want to disrupt our lives. We've kind of seen what that's like with COVID, and I'm not willing to do that. I don't think most people are willing to do that, not on a regular basis. And we also need to maintain a livable environment for future generations, for our children and our grandchildren. It needs to be good for the economy. It needs to spur innovation. It needs to create jobs, and it's going to need to replace jobs that are likely to become obsolete as new technologies are introduced. It needs to be effective. And what I mean by that is it needs to be wide-reaching and national in scale. It needs to make significant strides and rather quickly to start removing our dependence on fossil fuels. It needs to be inexpensive. We just spent, as a country, over $3 trillion on a stimulus package, and this policy should not add debt. It should let us maintain our sense of human liberty. People shouldn't be forced to do things they don't want to do. People should still be free to choose how they want to live their lives. It needs to be bipartisan. When there's turnover in Washington, we can't have a new administration come in and immediately change everything one way or another. And I think as business people, one of the most time-consuming and expensive tasks for us is trying to adjust to ever-changing policies and regulations. It needs to also promote social justice. And what I mean by that is it has to be something that people can get behind and feel like they're not being taken advantage of. And it also needs to take care of people that are disadvantaged and are being markedly impacted more by pollution and climate change than others that have means. So it seems like a lofty goal. And I didn't think I'd find any policy until I heard about carbon pricing. So first of all, when I say carbon, what I'm really talking about is CO2, which is a main greenhouse gas emission contributing to global warming. And when I talk about pricing carbon, the idea is quite simple. Carbon emissions have real dollar costs associated with them. For example, when I talked about fire insurance in California earlier, it's very costly due to climate change. And currently, residents like me are paying that higher cost in the form of higher insurance premiums. But we're certainly not the ones emitting all the carbon, or even most of it. The fair thing to do is price carbon at its source so that when it's extracted from the ground, those that are doing so are paying the costs, and that'll eventually cause down the road for people like me. By doing this, we're saying that companies can still extract and produce fossil fuels, but they'll have to pay the cost of doing so. This will incentivize companies and people to move away from fossil fuels and start investing more money in clean energy alternatives. Fossil fuel prices will go up. Clean energy prices will go down. It won't just be energy costs that change them. The entire system will change, anything that uses energy. So when fossil fuel energy is more expensive, cars, trucks, and everything else that uses fossil fuels will be more expensive, making their clean energy alternatives much better and much cheaper in comparison. So people, when possible, always choose a clean energy alternative. Economists have backed this idea for decades. Over 40 other companies have implemented carbon pricing in some form, and they've seen their emissions drop significantly. There's a second part to this, and that's the part of fees. And where do those fees or money that's collected from carbon go? There are many solutions to this, but our organization is proposing that the money go back to citizens in the form of dividends. As Congress has proven, sort of, with the COVID crisis, this is not that hard to do. And everybody would become an investor, in a sense, in this clean energy economy. The next question is, what would the impact of such a proposal be? This is the map of the US today. For each region, it shows what the cheapest energy source is for a specific region of the country. That is, for a given dollar value of investment, what source will give you the most energy? So we see in the majority of the US, it's natural gas. That's those little flames that we see. So for like the Midwest, it's wind. For the Southwest, it's solar. But the other areas of the country generally rely on natural gas. Natural gas, although I know we hear about it as kind of being a clean energy, it's still a fossil fuel. And when it's burned, it still is producing carbon. So here's what happens if you put a price on carbon. At $60 per metric ton, which is equivalent to about 50 cents a gallon in gasoline at the pump, we see now that map has changed pretty dramatically. We see that solar is the best choice in many areas of the country now. Wind continues to dominate in the Midwest, and it actually spreads down into parts of the central Southwest. And natural gas is not really that economical except in places like Washington and Idaho and parts of the northern part of the East Coast. So what will happen, instead of investing in natural gas plants, people and companies will start pouring their money into alternatives like installing solar panels. Demand and competition will incentivize people to innovate and to drive prices down, causing a chain reaction. So it turns out that we have something that we're trying to use right now called House Resolution 763, called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, that would achieve all the things I just talked about. As I said earlier, when I talked about a policy, what it would need to include, I said it needed to be effective, need to be good for people, needs to be good for the economy, and it needs to be revenue neutral. So let me quickly go through each of these. So if you look at the graph here, the blue line is current policy and kind of what's going on right now with current policy in terms of carbon emissions, and what we're looking for on the right is the percentage of drop in carbon emissions. And the bottom line is a timeline. So the black line represents HR 763, the Carbon Fee and Dividend Act. As you can see, it would create a dramatic drop in carbon emissions if we implement it. But how does it compare to other options? So first of all, if we looked at the US Paris Agreement, and that's the red dot that you're going to see up here, you can see that while that accord or that agreement creates a situation where carbon emissions drop significantly, they don't drop nearly as significantly as what we're talking about or as quickly, and they don't go down as far over time. And just for theoretical purposes, let's look at what happens if we said, well, let's just take every gas burning car off of the road and replace it with an electrical car. What would happen then is you see this gray line. And while it's a nice drop, it's not that great. And by the way, it would be incredibly disruptive to our economy to do something like that. So fee and dividend is also good for the people. And so if you look at what happens, we give the people the dividend back. It's good for people now because it doesn't really change their way of life, and in future because it maintains a little planet. But people aren't going to, 60% of people are going to get dividends that offset the cost completely. And those of us that don't get a dividend, it's only going to, we're going to see about a 2% increase in what we pay for energy. So it's really not disruptive for those of us that wouldn't get a dividend. Carbon fee and dividend is also good for the economy. So what's good for the people is also good for the economy. We'll reduce the health impacts on people associated with fossil fuels, which, by the way, totals billions of dollars every year. But apart even from these benefits, we see an increase in employment coming from this initiative. Clean energy will create jobs because there's all kinds of new technologies that will be employing, new infrastructure, et cetera. But some of the jobs will also be replacing jobs lost in the fossil fuel industry. The kinds of technologies we're talking about are solar, wind, biomass, and nuclear. Finally, fee and dividend is revenue neutral. And revenue neutral simply means that the money is sent back into the private economy instead of being spent by the government. And that's one of the reasons we really feel like those dividends should go back to the people. And as I said earlier, it also assures that people least able to bear the burden of increasing fuel costs do not bear the brunt of the burden from the policy because they'll be getting those fees back. So if you'll think back to what the musicians were missing, they're missing a musical score, an effective climate policy. Now let's just go back to my list, and I want to make sure that this achieves the values that I talked about. It's good for people now and for future generations. It aims for a clean world. It's good for the economy. It creates millions of clean energy jobs. And by the way, those will promote, it's going to promote domestic innovation and domestic jobs. It's effective. It's national in scope. It sets the incentives for clean energy in every corner of our economy. It's inexpensive. It pays for itself. There's no government investments necessary. It maintains human liberty. People aren't being told what to do. There are no regulations. You can still choose your gas car if you desire. And dividends put the choice in the hands of us, the people. And finally, it's bipartisan. What I've talked to you about are the core principles behind HR 763, also known as the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. It's an actual bill that's currently sitting in Congress, and it's supported by over 80 Republicans and Democrats. So at this point, I'm feeling hopeful. You know, it's more than just wishing that something was there. It's something is actually tangible we can think about, that we can have some hope we can get something done. And it's something also, just so you know, there's a number of economists and people that kind of understand what this would mean overall that have endorsed this. So I think we have a cause for hope at this point. Does anyone have any questions at this time?
Yeah, there's a couple of questions that have come through.
Sure.
On the chat. So I just want to make sure that we cover a couple of them. The one question was, have we passed the point of no return? And the honest answer to that is we don't really know. But I think that nonetheless, there's a moral obligation to do everything that we can to prevent the climate change from being calamitous. So, I mean, severe climate change is already upon us. That's already in the bank. The effects that we are seeing will continue to get worse for the next while. That's already in the bank. But the potential to overcome that and to get back to a situation where things are better is what I think drives us to try this.
Just so I can pipe in, Glenton, on that.
Yeah.
I don't like to say point of no return. There may be parts of the world where we're going to see significant damage. And as I mentioned, above the Arctic Circle, we're seeing really incredible changes up there due to climate change, and not in a positive way. But I don't like to think in terms of no return. And here's why. As humankind has achieved some amazing things, and we tend to be, as a people, and I'm talking as a world population, when faced with disasters as a people, we probably are at our best a lot of times. We are very innovative. I think people, when they decide that this is something to rally behind and really get behind it as humanity, we can achieve just about anything. So I would say that, yeah, we're at a point of no return for many parts of the world in terms of things being the same as they are now. But we can recover, and we can make it better so it doesn't happen again. So that's the optimist in me, and I actually truly believe that, because I honestly believe we are capable of doing anything as people if we put our minds to it. Sorry. Anyway, that's I'll get off my grandstand there, but that's actually how I really feel.
No, it's a good point. And then we've also got a question from Gary. We've got a number of questions. He says, how do new taxes create jobs? Taxing or increasing the price of fuel into obsolescence is not a realistic global strategy. especially when other countries in the world have no commitment to do the same. And people can simply pump oil from the ground or burn firewood or coal from the ground, both of which have a higher carbon cost. So, and then he talks about, don't you think the real solution is to reduce the cost of cleaner power such as nuclear, which can be produced for less than 2 cents per kilowatt hour. So rather than the huge cost of energy storage we get from wind or solar. So let me handle a couple of those points. Firstly, this isn't a tax in the traditional sense, it's a fee and dividend. So the depressing effect that taxes have on the economy are not incurred here. In fact, if anything, it's beneficial to the economy because it's pushing money back out in much the same way that the COVID stimulus package was beneficial. You know, I mean, obviously the economy suffered for other reasons, but the general view is that the payments that are sent to everyday Americans makes a big difference in a positive way to the economy. And that extra money in the pocket gets spent, and the way that that money gets spent will be informed by the price, and the price is determined, of course, or at least is impacted by the cost of energy. The other thing is that, you know, the idea of taxing something into obsolescence, obviously that would be disruptive, and our aim is not to be disruptive. So the way that this has been set up is that it starts with a relatively modest carbon fee of about $10 per ton, which is not a disruptive fee at all. But then what happens is it goes up on an annual basis. And so if you give people, business people especially, a reliable kind of image of the future, that this is the way things are going, people will start investing now, even though the cost hasn't happened. So it's a really, you get a very large impact, because people who are doing 10-year planning, you know, suddenly shift their views around, even though the actual cost that's being borne on the people who've already invested is not that high. In terms of the international impacts, well, let me quickly cover the nuclear. I mean, yes, any other power is going to become more competitive. The challenge with nuclear right now is not the carbon side of it, which is, you know, it's great. It's actually that it takes, you know, typically 10 years to get the first electrons produced from nuclear. And for that reason, solar and wind have actually overtaken nuclear globally as a, and on, you know, just on a fair basis, you know, on a market basis.
But just to interject real quick, Glenton,
yeah.
Our organization is not against nuclear, just so you know.
Yeah.
And there are nuclear technologies that are currently being evaluated by the NRC that will be safer and will probably be much more quickly implemented than the light water reactors that we're putting out there today. So nuclear is certainly an alternative that may make sense, especially with the energy density ratio that nuclear offers. So that is on the table. We are not saying that nuclear is something that shouldn't be considered. We do think it should be considered because it does not emit greenhouse gases. And really our big issue is climate change. So I don't want you guys to think that we're here saying, gee, we think it should be solar and wind. But like Glenton said, that's been the direction, because nuclear up till now has been almost a non-option. NRC hasn't been issuing new licenses or anything. So realistically, I think nuclear plays a part in this, especially with the new technologies that are coming out. So sorry, Glenton, go ahead.
No, I mean, that's absolutely right. And you know, this is a kind of conservative solution in the sense that it allows the market to determine the best solution. You know, it's not sort of going to try and ram one solution or another down anyone's throat. It's just putting the incentive on it. And what you find is that in a lot of cases, the differential between the fossil fuel cost and the, you know, some other non-fossil fuel energy is I mean, in many cases, it's already leaning towards the clean energy. But with a small, even a very modest tax, the switch happens relatively quickly, certainly on the electricity side.
And I like to think of this as not a tax per se. And economists wouldn't call this a tax. And the reason they don't call it a tax is because it's a cost. It's a cost that actually, I'll use oil companies. They're the biggest producers, if you will, of fossil fuels. It's a cost they've actually shifted to us as consumers. So we're experiencing the impact of fossil fuel in what we're purchasing and such. And so it's a way that they've shifted a cost that really they should be absorbing into their business that we as consumers have been absorbing in the products that we're actually buying. So it's not the same as a tax. It's just where is that cost actually captured? And what economists are saying is we should capture that cost at the source, not at the end of the food chain, which is where we're feeling it as consumers now. We're feeling the burden of what should be captured up front by the oil companies. And by the way, Gary, just one thing I think to note in all of you, there's 3 oil companies that are behind the carbon and fee approach, pricing carbon and fee approach. One is Total, one is British Petroleum, and the other is Shell. So 3 of the majors are actually behind this approach, because what it does in essence is it makes it fair for all the fossil fuel companies. The last thing these guys want is a region by region or country by country approach to this. It's much better for them to have it be a broad approach that everybody's on the same playing field. And that way, like Glenton said, if you know that you're all going to have to deal with that as an oil industry, then you can make plans, long-term plans that account for that. So anyway, that's where.
So how do we address, countries like China and India that they don't buy into any of this stuff? They're the biggest polluters in the world.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Gary. Go ahead, Glenton. We do account for that in the bill, because that's a great question.
So great question. I mean, the 2 things in terms of the bill, the HR 763 has a border adjustment, meaning that anything that we export from this country, if it's going to a country that doesn't have a comparable tax, it gets reimbursed at the border. So US goods are not at a disadvantage relative to foreign countries. And anything being imported, if it's coming from a country that doesn't have that tax, it gets the fee added on. So it levels the playing field at the border. So the fee is applied when it comes out the ground or when it comes over the border. The general view, and obviously, as soon as you get into international politics, things get more complicated. But the general view is that if the US gets behind this, it will not be long before other countries start following suit.
Especially if we're doing that, the border leveling. If we do that, it's not to anybody's advantage to not do it, if that makes sense. And I know it's more complicated than just talking about it at this level, but it is part of the bill, and it is something that we're looking at.
Yeah.
Glenton, I think what we should probably do is, I don't want to run out of time without you being able to complete your portion, and then we can address whatever questions we have time for at the end. Yeah, and those that we can address, we'll send some written answers to Fred, and then he can disseminate those to everybody. If that's all right, is everybody okay with that approach? Okay.
Okay. So yeah, thanks, Jeff. That was great. So what do we need to do for that last step? How do we get it over the line? So that's where the action comes in. At the end of the day, solving this climate crisis is a political problem, and it's up to us to tell our members of Congress that we care about climate and we support the idea of a price on carbon. That's essentially what we do at the Citizens Climate Lobby. Here's a photo of some of our volunteers outside the office of our Congresswoman, Katie Porter. And in the age of COVID, here's a screenshot of us talking to her over Zoom. Katie said that was the only non-COVID meeting she was taking. Katie Porter is now a co-sponsor of the bill, but she was originally not on board with this. It was with the support of constituents like us that she finally came around to support the bill. The Climate Orchestra can't be effective without its musicians, and we are the musicians that can drive the solution to the finish line. So we don't want you to agree, we don't want you to support us, we don't want you to like this idea or hope that it passes or wish us well on our quest. We want you to become activists with us. So what does that mean? We've developed a little acrostic, which you can see on the bottom of the slide there. Join us on the path to HR 763. So the path. The P is for persevere. The A is for ask, the T is for tell, and the H is for HR 763. So let me quickly go through these. First, persevere. There's nothing I can teach Rotary members about perseverance. You've been active since 1905, and you all understand how to keep going until we get there. It is hugely important that we get this bill passed, and we need your help to get it done. All such battles, as you know, I'm sure, have seemed impossible until they're done, and this one will feel no different. It needs a sustained effort, and we're asking you to move HR 763 to the top of your climate activities and to move climate change to the top of your priority list. So the P of path is for persevere. The A of path is for ask. We want you to ask everyone you know to join us on the path. Like I'm now asking you, we want you to ask others. How do you do that? Ask everyone you know. Give talks like this one. Get a shirt, get a bumper sticker, get business cards. Ask your friends and family. Ask people 6 feet away in the checkout line. Write letters to their editors. Any way you can, do. The Citizens Climate Lobby is organized into hundreds of local chapters across the US and around the world, and these chapters build political support for climate action with respect, gratitude, and appreciation. I suspect that resonates with Rotary members. So the T of path is for tell. You have people who work for you. You can tell them what you want. You can tell them to co-sponsor the bill. You have companies that you work for. Work with us to get them to endorse the bill. Maybe some of you are famous or know someone famous. Ask them to endorse the bill. This photo of Katie Porter, our Congresswoman, she already supports it. But even then, we think it's important to thank her for her support and to urge her to pressure her colleagues in Congress to join her in that support. You can do that any way you want. You could join our calling campaign. You can go to that website, the www.cclcalls.org. And Jeff, maybe you can put that into the link into the chat. I mean, I'm sure many of you have called your members of Congress. It's super easy. It takes less than 5 minutes, and the website makes it sort of a paint by numbers exercise. Or you can write to your representative. You know, again, we have resources to support that at the Citizens Climate Lobby website. And of course, this is an issue that we need to vote on. It's important that our representatives hear from us because they use that information to decide what topics to focus on. At the end of the month, they literally tally the issues that people have called about and use that to prioritize their work. So if climate is at the top, then they will work on climate. And we're so close. And with your help, I think we can do this. And finally, so we've got persevere, ask, tell, and the H of path is for HR 763. We don't want you to stop doing all the other good things you're doing, both for climate change and in other areas. But we want HR 763 to be at the top of your list right now. This is the single best thing that we can do that has a hope of succeeding. So join us as activists for HR 763 and play the climate concerto with us. One of the things that attracted me to CCL is that when I signed up, I got a phone call from my local chapter within a few days and was roped in with like-minded people. It helps to keep the energy levels up. CCL allows us to reclaim our democracy, to ensure that Congress is hearing what we want, and to do so in a constructive, positive way that allows everyone to come to the table on their terms. So thank you so much for listening to us. We've got other ways to get into onto more information about CCL, but we would love this to be the start of a conversation and for us to continue to work together. And we obviously, any questions, I know we're running a lot late on time, got a few minutes left though.
Thanks, everyone. Brad, it's your nickel at this point.
Okay, he's not unmuting himself, I guess.
I'm unmuting now. I've unmuted. Okay, there's a couple more things on the chat, aren't there? Yeah, the nuclear thing. I've seen nuclear stuff go from the rage to unprofitability. I remember when I was a kid, Detroit Edison was getting into nuclear. It was going to be the greatest thing since sliced bread. And then all of a sudden, we've got nuclear plants all over. And then, of course, we had Chernobyl and the thing in the East Coast where they spewed out
3 Mile Island.
Yeah, that's a 3 Mile Island. And then I've been hearing that to get rid of the nuclear waste, the used stuff is, I mean, it's got a 1,000,000-year half-life. So we've stored it in caves, and we're running out of places to store it. So what really is the future of nuclear? I mean, is there any future in nuclear?
Yeah, there is, because we're looking at a completely different technology than what was used. I mean, the bottom line is when they created nuclear, back in Oak, whatever it was, it's been a long time since I looked at it, but they originally designed it as light water reactors, which is what they used. It was then used in nuclear submarines who have a water sink, easy, right? If the thing starts to overheat, you got a problem, you just let the ocean in and it cools it off, no problem. The problem we've had with light water reactors in, Fukushima or whatever in Japan and in 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, is that when we've had a problem and we've not been able to cool the rods because we've lost power to the plant, you get a meltdown. And what happens is it melts through its containment vehicle, and it ends up releasing nuclear waste into the ground and the air. The new technologies are self-contained, and they are not using the same technology. So they literally will shut themselves down. The reaction will stop without having to have a coolant system that's independent and trying to cool them. So new technologies are very different than what we were seeing with the older technologies. And the reason you didn't see those newer technologies sooner is that we really needed new materials and new approaches to nuclear. And nobody was really willing to invest in that because the NRC, at least in the US, the NRC was really shutting everything down. And just an example, Bill Gates has a company that's been investing heavily in nuclear, and he had to do all his testing in Russia because we couldn't even do the testing in the United States. Those are thorium reactors. And by the way, thorium is a non-weapons grade nuclear material. And so it is very different. It's a good question, Fred, but we're really looking at a new era in nuclear. And as I mentioned, the NRC over 40 years has not even looked at new nuclear technologies and not considered it in terms of licensing or anything. And at this point, they've recently, within the past year, accepted a new technology that they're studying vigorously, and hope to have some decisions in the next 12 months as to where they stand and such. And in the industry, they're very optimistic that they're going to approve this new technology. So, and it's relevant. This is relevant. We can't just get locked into one type of technology or technologies, especially since fossil fuels have been pervasive around the world. What we do know is that nuclear is not, it may create a different kind of problem, and you've touched upon one. But right now, to mitigate climate change, we need to keep all options on the table. And realistically, nuclear cannot be off the table at this point. It's got to be considered, and we need to be looking at innovations in nuclear as well as other things that are being looked at. So I hope that answers your question, but that's kind of where things are at from my research.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Is there anybody else that's got any questions that they want to propose? We're kind of at the end of our time. Fortunately, we started early, so we got all through your presentation, and I really thank you both for coming. I apologize for the lack of preparation on my part for the introductions, because I've been working on something right up till the moment we started. And
well, that's all right. I think everybody got the idea of who we are. So.
Yeah.
I think we introduced ourselves twice. We got so thrown off. So anyway.
Good. Well, that's good. And thank you very much for the presentation. I really appreciate it. If no one else has any questions, I will call our meeting to close, and I would highly recommend your presentation to other Rotary groups. And as I talk to the other presidents locally, I will certainly give your name to them. I would remind our Rotarians that we have no speakers set except the 17th of September, when our district governor will be speaking to us, Gianna. And that's it. So we either have, ad hoc presentations, or maybe we cancel meetings, but I would encourage everybody who knows somebody to call them and call me so we can schedule speakers. With that, I will close the meeting and thank you all for coming. I'll gong the bell, and everybody can go back to their endeavors, whatever they're doing. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank you very
again.
much, guys.